At this moment, I wish to say a few words regarding the emerging situation across North America concerning the rediscovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children who died while under occupation while attending government and Christian church-run boarding schools in the colonized countries of Canada and the United States. At the present moment, over 1,500 graves have been identified. This number will undoubtedly increase as more searches are completed throughout these two countries. This number also does not include those lives that may have been lost when our children ran away from schools in an attempt to return home and may have perished due to the elements. This number does not include those lives that were sold off by so-called adoption agencies to non-Indigenous families, either for disposal or for profit. And this number does not include those lives that were born in this atmosphere of occupation, as they were conceived under abuse and violently disposed of before any record of their life took place. While this number will grow as more inquiries are made, the world has begun to hear what Indigenous peoples have been saying for decades. But this number also does not include the countless unmarked graves of Indigenous ancestors all throughout North America, whose peace is constantly disturbed by grave robbers and trinket hunters who still pillage burial sites and mound sites to this day. I stand here today appalled at these discoveries. I stand here aghast as some of our deepest fears have come to fruition with this knowledge of unmarked graves. But once again, it must be acknowledged that survivors told us what was going on. Indigenous peoples have been saying this is the situation, but the strained voices and calls for justice only fell on deaf ears. But the reality is, these countries did not listen. Churches did not listen, and allies of Indigenous peoples only vaguely listened. While we applaud the efforts of Secretary Deb Haaland and her initiative to investigate the U.S. boarding schools, the U.S. remains guilty in acknowledging this level of genocide, this part of its history, and its continued perpetuation of assimilation tactics that do not affirm the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, domestically or abroad. Grassroots organizations for decades have been documenting the stories of what happened behind the gates and doors of these boarding and residential schools, but still have yet to be heard at a wide-scale level. Today, for those that can hear, let them listen and act. I have witnessed Native American and non-Native American members of the United Methodist Church display complacency in discussing this horrific history. This has led to a corporate negligence. It is now time for them to give full disclosure as a denomination and transparency to any and all connections to missionary entities and any connection they may have had with these schools. In addition, full funding behind this work must be put in place as it affirms the work of the U.S. Department of Interior. It must also return ancestral lands to Indigenous communities and any form of reparation that will support the work of reconstruction of Indigenous identity and cosmology that were impacted by these schools. I also call upon all denominations of the Christian faith and members of the ecumenical community to engage in the same work of disclosing any connection that they may have had to boarding and residential schools and work to restore and affirm Indigenous movements, to restore identities that have been forever impacted by this era. We must also recognize that worldwide, these tactics of assimilation are still taking place and must cease. I call upon all entities, whether secular or Christian related, to abandon practices that remove children from families and territorial domains and cease practices that undermine Indigenous self-determination. As many of you know, I also am a cultural practitioner who works diligently to ensure our Indigenous cosmologies and ways of life are not further impacted by assimilation and colonization. In our communities, our elders ask that we work to preserve our way of life so our children will have it for their own. This is my hope today as we acknowledge this history and as we work to build a future of wellness for all of our people.